Welcome, guests and listeners, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Hassan Shanawani. I'm the president of American Muslim Health Professionals, and I'll be your host today. The last year has been like no other. Because of this mass epidemic, the pandemic caused by the coronavirus that we all know, COVID-19, the world has seen over 100 million cases and millions of deaths. In America, we may soon have over 500,000 people who have lost their lives to COVID-19. COVID-19, the pandemic, every day has hurt our health, not only physically, but our mental health, emotional, financial, and occupational, and even spiritual health. But there's hope. 20 years of research, billions of dollars, thousands of people around the world have come together, and we have now not one, but several vaccines that we hope are going to protect us. We have with us today 3 special guests to tell us about the COVID-19 pandemic, share with us their knowledge and experience, tell us a little bit about the vaccine and their vision and hope for the future. This event today is being brought to you by American Muslim Health Professionals in partnership with over 100 Muslim and public health organizations. My first guest is someone you all know, Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's a physician, patient advocate, and scientist who's been doing research in epidemic infections for as long as I can remember. His own work has been in HIV, lung infections, tuberculosis, malaria, and emerging diseases such as Ebola and Zika. He's advised 7 presidents on HIV and AIDS and many other domestic and global health issues, and is now Dr. Biden's advisor on the COVID pandemic here in the US, and he's a worldwide leader in the effort against this pandemic. Dr. Fauci, thanks and welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
My first question for you is, people have been scared. My own mom, my own colleagues, I'm a practicing pulmonologist, have expressed the fear that this vaccine is new and experimental. I personally remember 20 years ago when we had this severe outbreak of this virus known as SARS, and every Muslim around the world knows MERS, which affected the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi and the pilgrimage. Give it some history, because people think that we put this is 10 months of research going into this virus.
Well, if you look at the time it took from the time that the Chinese put the sequence of the virus on a public database on January the 10th of 2020 to the time we went into a phase 1, then a phase 3 trial, and then ultimately had vaccine going into the arms of individuals, literally 11 months after the virus was first identified. By anybody's imagination, that's the fastest that has ever been done in the history of vaccinology. But the important point to bring out is that that was not by compromising safety, nor was it by compromising scientific integrity. It was the results and the fruits of fundamental basic research that has made extraordinary advances in the science of vaccine platform technology. But that did not start in January of 2020. It was the result of work that was done for at least a decade to be able to develop these vaccine platforms, as well as to do important things like the stabilization of the spike protein immunogen in a form that was highly immunogenic. So it is true that it was extraordinarily fast, relatively speaking. But the point we need to make to people who question that is that this was speed as a result of scientific advances, not as a result of cutting corners or as the result of being recklessly fast.
We're hearing a lot of talk about the new variants of COVID, and as a physician and scientist, I know that there are 150 strains of flu and a lot of different coronavirus strains. We've mentioned SARS and MERS, and there's other ones, 229 and CO43. Is the drifting of this virus somehow different than other viruses that we deal with every day?
Actually, not at all. SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus, and we know from extensive experience in virology that RNA viruses will mutate. They mutate spontaneously, but they also mutate when pressure is put on them, either immunological pressure, like with vaccines and people's own immune response in their body, or therapeutic pressures, such as with antivirals. Most of the mutations that occur in RNA viruses are not relevant. They are not associated with any functional change in the virus. But every once in a while, a constellation of mutations occur to lead in a new variant, as we call it, or a new lineage. And some of these have functional consequences. The variants that we're seeing now with SARS-CoV-2 are showing some physiologic and functional relevance. For example, the 117 lineage in the UK has an association with an increase in capability of transmitting from person to person, and may also have an increase to some degree in virulence. It does not seem to escape the protection afforded by the vaccines that we're currently using. In contrast, another constellation of mutations leading to the 351 variant in South Africa is more ominous, because that has been able to elude some of the monoclonal antibodies that have been used for treatment, as well as diminish, not completely eliminate, but diminish to some extent the capability of antibodies induced by the vaccine to suppress the virus. So these are things that we must pay attention to and take seriously, because they will inform things that we must do. For example, like developing a booster shot that might be expressing the spike protein that represents the actual variant that's in the community.
Switching gears a little bit, I want to talk with you not so much about COVID per se, but about your own experience as a leader in research. I remember myself personally back in the 80s and 90s, the relationship between the research community and grassroots efforts. I'm thinking specifically about HIV and AIDS. And I'm thinking now in today's world of social media, there's been this uneasy relationship between the research community in general and people advocating for new therapies. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts about sort of emerging diseases and public demand for research accountability, and just that relationship in general between the NIH, universities, industry, and the people that we serve.
Well, they're really very different relationships. The relationship between the NIH and the university is really the fundamental basis of how we fund peer-reviewed research, because the NIH is the largest research and research funding organization in the world by far, with a budget of over $42 billion. Most of the money that goes out from the NIH goes to grantees and contractors in universities and medical centers throughout the country and the world. The other issue that you bring, and also we have the same sort of collaborative interaction with industry, particularly the pharmaceutical industry, as shown by the extraordinary collaboration that has gone into the development of a number of vaccines for COVID-19, two of which have already received emergency use authorization in the United States, namely the Moderna and the Pfizer product. But you also asked the question about how social media and communication interacts and impacts on what we do. Well, there are positive aspects of that and negative aspects of that. The positive aspects are that good, correct, informative data and evidence is made available to the public very quickly. This is something that is really characteristic of the last decade or so. However, the availability of input into social media on the part of anyone and everyone also has its downside, in that often there is misinformation that gets spread through that medium. And so what we try to do in the scientific community is to speak through the appropriate channels. Some of that's social media, some of that is peer-reviewed scientific journals, and some of that is scientific conferences and meetings in which people exchange information. So all in all, things are working reasonably well. And actually, if you look at the track record of the scientific advances made in a relatively short period of time with COVID-19, it really is quite impressive.
And along those lines, about that relationship, American Muslims are a diverse community. 30% of American Muslims self-identify as African Americans, and that community in particular has suffered a lot from COVID. We'll hear more from our guests after you about that. 30% are of South Asian origin, and about 15 and 20% are people like myself, children of Middle Eastern immigrants. It's a big source of pride for the Muslim community that we've been contributing to the development of the vaccine. Tell us, speaking now to the lay community, not so much the scientific community, what are some examples of research partnerships that you're aware of that can help Americans get access to that latest research, and maybe some recommendations for minority communities so that we can get more participatory in some of that research effort?
Well, we have made a major effort that is ongoing right now for what we call equity, namely getting both accessibility to research protocols such as clinical trials, as well as accessibility to products when they are shown to be safe and effective. For example, if one goes back to the beginning of the 30,000 person and 44,000 person clinical trials of Moderna and Pfizer, respectively, we put a major effort into getting representation of minority communities, particularly brown and black people, in the clinical trials. And in some of those, we actually were quite successful. For example, with Moderna, we got a little bit over 10% of African Americans. We were aiming towards 13, but getting a little bit over 10, I think, was good. We did much better with the Latinx community. There was about 18% of the population is Latinx in the United States, and we got 21% of the people who are in the vaccine trial were Latinx. So that worked well. But now that we have vaccine that is available in an emergency use authorization, the task is to make sure that the vaccine gets equitably distributed to minority populations. Brown people, black people, Muslims, Native Americans, Alaskan Native, Pacific Islanders, all of the people who generally don't get easy access to broad public health products such as vaccines and therapeutics. In fact, President Biden has formed an equity task force that is chaired by an African-American female physician named Marcella Nunez Smith, who is responsible for making sure that we get equitable access to things like vaccines to all people in the country, Muslims, African-Americans, whites, the entire demographic display of people.
Thanks so much for that. The response to the COVID pandemic tells us, I think this is the first time I can think of where people had a front row seat, where they really saw the science unrolling in real time with the diagnosis, treatment, and ultimately the vaccine and prevention of the disease. And I think experts will hear some more from our next two speakers about the lack of faith that healthcare professionals on the front line have faced and skepticism. 15 years ago, you would see the occasional international traveler wearing masks, but today people still question mask wearing. This week, the CDC says now 2 masks are better than 1. What would you say to experts who are addressing the public for the first time? You've been doing this for 40 years. I imagine there are also a few skeptics watching us now. If you're in a room of people that you know that don't trust the scientific community, what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, you have to respect people's skepticism and don't immediately jump on them and criticize them for it. So rather than telling them that they have no idea what they're talking about, I think you need to embrace them and engage them. And that's what we've tried to do. That's what I've tried to do, as you said, over the last 4 decades. We need to show, and it is, I think, rather easy to do, that science really dominates when you think in terms of public health measures. And when you lead in the sense of developing guidelines, developing recommendations, that you have to base that on fundamental scientific evidence and data. Because in the history of everything we've done in public health, there's no doubt that scientific data leads to the best outcome. I mean, that's something that time and time again has proven. We just need to convince people who have skepticism about the scientific method. For example, the validity of it. One example that people say, well, you say that these vaccines are safe and effective. How do we know that? Is this just the federal government trying to put something over on us, or is this the pharmaceutical company trying to make a lot of money? What you do is have patience to explain that the process of deciding whether something is safe and effective is the result of a well-organized 30,000 and 44,000 person clinical trials. And the results, the analysis of the results, are fundamentally in the hand of independent bodies. We call them data and safety monitoring boards. They examine the data, and when they feel the data is strong enough to make a determination, they then allow the data to be seen by the company, which then presents it to the FDA, whose career scientists examine the data and, in association, again, with their independent advisory committees, make a determination if the vaccine is appropriate to be distributed throughout the country. That is exactly what happened with the two vaccines that currently are available through emergency use authorization. So when people have skepticism about the science, you've got to convince them, and I think it's easy to do, that the process is both transparent and independent and not influenced by non-scientific factors. I think that is a thing that is easy to demonstrate to people.
Along those lines, thinking now about the vaccine, we know that experts agree that vaccines are recommended. My children took DPT, MMR, measles, mumps, rubella. As a child, I remember taking I don't remember, but I have the scar to show my smallpox vaccine. My dad took some pneumonia ones. Do you think the COVID vaccine is going to be one of these one and done type of things? Or do you think it might be a recurring one, more like influenza? And do you think it might need to become a routine for adults or school kids in the future?
You know, I wish I had a definitive answer to that, but we don't know. What we don't know is the durability of the vaccine response. I hope it's a considerable period of time, but we don't know that as a fact right now. We're going to have to work that out and observe over a period of a few years, if not longer. The other factor that comes into play is how much mutation and drift antigenically will occur. And this relates to the fact that even if we get the overwhelming majority of people in the United States vaccinated and we get good protection, as long as there's a significant amount of COVID-19 throughout the world, there will continue to be evolving mutations and new variants. That being the case, I hope that we don't have to be dealing with that. But if that's the case, then it very well may be that over a period of time, we will have to vaccinate people with updated and upgraded vaccines to keep up with the evolution of this particular virus. That is entirely conceivable, but we don't know that right now.
We have time, I think, just for a couple more questions. The first one is just your vision of the future. I don't think we're ever going to go back to life before COVID. I think masks are they're like seatbelts. They're probably here to stay. I can think of other changes, seatbelts, bicycle helmets. We got rid of smoking in restaurants. Somehow this feels a little different. How do you see our society, Americans stepping up to meet this challenge?
Well, I think that until we get a degree of virus that's so low that in and of itself is not a threat, I think we will be wearing masks for a considerable period of time. It might be that we accept the wearing of masks the way some of the Asian countries do, where people don't wear masks all the time. They wear it sometimes when they're out or when they're not feeling well. They feel there's a lot of viral illness in the community, and they wear masks. That very well may be the case. Again, it's too early in this to be able to say that, but I think that there will be some changes that will be different from the normality as we perceive it today.
And then finally, just because we are an advocacy organization advocating for health professionals, you've achieved celebrity status. Looking back now on your career as a mentor to the people that we serve in AMHP, people want to be like Tony. They want to be like you, Dr. Fauci. More kids today are learning epidemiology. People know the word epidemiology, data science, app development. We have a need for STEM, science, tech, emergent engineering, medicine like never before. Your grandkid comes to you and asks for career advice. What would you tell her to study?
Well, if my grandchild has any propensity towards science, I would try and explain to her that the opportunities and the gratification and the ability to make major contributions to society are extraordinarily high when you think in terms of a scientific career, be it a biomedical science or even some of the physical science. It's discovery of the unknown, and it's doing it for the betterment of mankind. So I would encourage her, if she has any inclination to go into science, that it almost certainly would be a very gratifying career.
Dr. Fauci, I know you're busy. Thank you so much for your work and service and for your time with us today.
Thank you.
A brief thanks from American Muslim health professionals to our many partners today, and a reminder to our watchers to see more content like this. We hope that you go to our website and support our work. We have two other guests with us today that I'm excited to share with you, starting first with Dr. Sharif El-Nahal. He's the president and CEO of University Hospitals in Newark and was a leader in Newark and in New Jersey's efforts in the early days of the pandemic. He was previously the 21st Health Commissioner for the state of New Jersey for their Department of Health and the Chief Quality and Safety Officer for the VA under President Obama. And he currently also is a volunteer member of the Joe Biden presidential transition team, helping with COVID and with veterans. I'll be introducing Dr. Abdul Haq in a second, but first for you, Dr. El-Nahal, can you talk a little bit about the techniques that you've used at Newark Hospital, at University Hospitals, that have been successful in encouraging people? You heard Dr. Fauci, they're hesitant to take the vaccine, especially in the communities of color that you serve in New Jersey and Newark. What is their journey from hesitancy to acceptance? What does that look like?
Well, thank you, Dr. Shanawani. I also want to thank American Muslim health professionals for organizing this event and bringing somebody like Dr. Fauci to the table to speak to our community. I think it's a really welcome step and really tremendous opportunity to learn from one of the world's foremost experts. I'm glad to be part of the panel as well. I have to say that this is a journey for a lot of people, especially in communities of color. And some people don't understand that. Folks who have been grown up and enculturated into a life where science is accepted for what it is, where there's trust in institutions ad hoc. That's not necessarily the case in communities of color, especially in Black and brown communities. And that skepticism was well rooted in the history of systemic racism, sometimes by the medical establishment itself, against the very communities you're trying to convince right now to take this vaccine. Just a couple of examples. The history of slavery also involved people doing experimental surgeries, gynecologic surgeries, on enslaved women leading up to the Tuskegee trials, which purposefully took a group of Black men who had served this country in the military, who they knew had syphilis, didn't tell them they had syphilis, and studied the quote-unquote natural history of the disease and did not treat them for it, and instead told them a lie, which was that they were getting free health care from the federal government. Certainly we learned a lot about syphilis, but at the human expense of Black Americans in this country, people who had served this country in uniform. There are so many other examples. Henrietta Lacks, a woman whose cells were stolen from her without her knowledge, used for great scientific research that was ultimately led to therapies and just more knowledge about how biology works, but without her knowledge, without her consent, and without credit until much later. And so, of course, you have these narratives and these stories in communities like Newark and Black and brown communities across the country, where people take that and say, why should we trust a medical establishment, a government that has done this to us before? So we have to walk through that door of trust, and that takes time. It takes us earning the badge of trustworthiness as we approach communities and say, we are willing to take the vaccine ourselves. We are willing to participate in clinical trials as leaders in public health and leaders of healthcare institutions. but we're also willing to sit there and listen and acknowledge the fact that that skepticism is well-rooted and very different from the quote-unquote anti-vaccinator campaigns of misinformation and disinformation. It's completely different. This is a skepticism that's different. It's well-rooted in good reasons for being skeptical. And once you establish that trust, you can start to answer some of the scientific questions, as Dr. Fauci just did, around why the science was able to be done in a less than a year, but still yield effective vaccines and still done rigorously. These are things that we can do in terms of dispelling myths, conspiracy theories, but only after we break through that door of trust.
You mentioned this history of hesitancy that's founded in a skepticism from years, decades, systemic racism and the lived experience of minority people versus disinformation, which is this deliberate, intentional effort to harm people. So a question for you, just personally, on a personal level, as you serve the people of Newark, the people of New Jersey, and as a practicing Muslim, what are the principles that you draw from your faith to help walk people away from some of that skepticism and from the disinformation, that some of which that comes from our own community, the conspiracy theories, once you feel that you might have that door of trust that might be opened?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because what folks have done who intend to spread disinformation and destabilize our society and our communities is they've taken advantage, in some cases exploited these skeptical narratives that exist in communities of color, and have inserted lies into the conversation to encourage people not to take the vaccine. And so, especially in the Muslim community, one thing I want to emphasize is that, I was brought up in a family that emphasized science and emphasized the need to make sure that you listen to people with knowledge. And I do believe the faith reflects that. I had a conversation with a scholar last night, and I asked, what evidence of this tradition is there in our scripture and in our writings? And he pointed me to a passage in Surah Al-Anbiya, which I'll read the English translation here. It says, "And we sent not before you, O prophet, except men to whom we revealed the message. So ask the people of the message if you do not know." This is interpreted not only for people who know the message of Allah and of our faith, but also the message of truth, the message of knowledge, of science. We had Dr. Fauci on here. He's not Muslim, but he's one of the world's foremost experts on this matter. And even though I've been living through COVID pandemic every day, leading a safety net hospital in a vulnerable community, I hung on to every word he said because I learned something new every time I listened to him. That is our tradition. Our tradition is to learn, is to be humble, and is to defer to expertise, not to a YouTuber in their bedroom, not to an anonymous Twitter account or Facebook account that happens to be purporting that they know something about the vaccine or that the vaccine will harm you in some way, but actually is calling on us to check our sources and defer to that expertise. And so I would call upon all of us to follow our own tradition and to listen to people who know what they're talking about, who have expertise, who have spent their life's work doing this. And every one of them is telling us that the vaccines, especially the ones that have gotten emergency use authorization from the FDA, are safe and effective, and you should get it as soon as you are eligible.
Along those lines, I'd like to bring in actually another expert. Let me introduce us, our watchers, to Dr. Noorjahan Abdul-Haq. Dr. Abdul-Haq is a pediatrician and owner of Peace of Mind Pediatrics in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And she's been part of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition, which has been serving the needs of American Muslims since the beginning of the pandemic. Dr. Abdul-Haq, you have particular experience as a pediatrician and expert in child mental health and an advocate for minority communities. A number of challenges that Dr. Al-Nahal was talking about, especially the challenges with safe schooling, the impact the pandemic has had on child mental health and on health disparities in our effort towards health equity. First, let me start with the same question I asked Dr. Al-Nahal, which is, what has your experience been with the systemic racism, specifically with COVID in your practice and in the advocacy work that you've been doing over the last year?
Yes, thank you all so much for having me. it's a very difficult situation that we are in. I think that when COVID hit, it just really showed the underlying inequities that we have within the healthcare system, especially in America. A lot of what I'm seeing is multi-generational families. And so you may have a parent, like everyone's been staying home and, taking precautions, but then you have a parent who's an essential worker who may work at Walmart or work in a place that they're exposed on a regular basis. And then they often can bring, COVID home to the family members. And since a lot of homes are multi-generational, or a lot of families, the grandparents have now become the caretakers because family members don't necessarily want to send them to daycares. So I've seen a lot of grandparents becoming infected. And I know just a few weeks ago, one of my patients came in and he had lost both his grandmother and his great grandmother. And it's just very devastating to see the trauma that is occurring in many of these children's lives as we're losing our matriarchs and our patriarchs of these families who are also the caretakers. And so you have just level and level of issues that this pandemic has definitely unsurfaced.
And along those same lines, Dr. Al-Nahal was talking a little bit, not just about the misinformation and the systemic racism, but a deliberate disinformation. I myself, as a practicing lung doctor and ICU doctor, have experienced, as I'm literally putting people on life support, they're telling me, this isn't COVID, you're lying to me. The systemic skepticism has been incredible. In your own practice, what is the disinformation as a Muslim woman, as a health advocate, as a medical professional in Oklahoma, and with your work with the COVID Coalition, what have you been seeing? Well,
this isn't new. And I think that for a lot of people, it appears to be new, that the distrust of the medical system, but this isn't something that's been around for quite some time. And as a pediatrician, I have many parents who come in and have told me about things being put into other vaccines. And several were saying they didn't want to get any more of their childhood immunizations because they thought that people were putting COVID inside of the other immunizations. I mean, the amount of disinformation that's being spread is tremendous. And unfortunately, unless those of us who have the knowledge continue to speak out, to continue to engage these individuals and actually showing some of those proofs, that information spreads really fast. And I've gotten a lot of WhatsApp messages with false information and telling me all these types of things. And as a scientist, I was actually a biochemistry major, so I always will consider myself a scientist. It just frustrates me because I'm like, how do I explain the truth in this scientific process to someone who maybe hates science, someone who's never took a science course outside of what was recommended in high school? How do you really explain those things and combat these myths? And so it takes a lot of effort, and it's going to take a lot of time, especially for medical professionals. I mean, American Muslim Health Professionals is an organization of health professionals. And it's important that anyone watching, we take out the time not to just quote facts, because it's not the facts that people can hear facts. That's not what it is, but actually to truly try to explain a lot of the information and why those things are false. I'll give you just a quick example. People are like, well, obviously the virus was created because it has a patent. What people don't understand is that if you actually go and look, what is the patent? It might be that somebody took the sequence that we already knew, changed it a little bit, and that way they're able to then produce a vaccine. This isn't something that's new. It's something that has been existing for, several years. And it's just that once you figure out what the product is, you put a patent on it so that, because you've cracked the code. So it's really important that we kind of explain that to people. That doesn't mean somebody went and created it and now the government gave you a patent. That's not how this thing works. But really understanding some of those intricacies that many just have not had the privilege of really being exposed to.
A question to you both. Let's start with you, Dr. Al-Nahal. How can faith-based groups, you've been partnering, both of you, in your respective work, talk about the work with faith-based groups and how can they help with access and smooth delivery? Getting access to the vaccine has been a real challenge here in Michigan, where I work and live. It's been a challenge. Starting with you, Dr. Al-Nahal, what are your thoughts there?
I think it's a great question, Dr. Shanawani, because especially in the communities that have been devastated disproportionately by this pandemic, you'll find that the most trusted institutions are often institutions of faith, churches, mosques, and other houses of worship. that really emphasize, welcoming people in and have had the trust of people for decades throughout their whole lives in many cases. And so one of our first tasks, because we knew that here in Newark, New Jersey, was to hold sessions not only for the community overall, but specifically to these faith leaders to help convince them and guide them through their journey in accepting the vaccine. And just this week, we had many faith leaders throughout Newark publicly get their vaccine and encourage their congregations to do so. That didn't happen overnight. We started doing this work all the way back in the fall when we were doing clinical trials, and we knew, and we hoped rather, that one of them at least would be approved ultimately. But we knew we had to start that work well in advance. And because of that, just one anecdote that I heard earlier today when I was on a phone call with the superintendent of schools here in Newark, with whom we are also partnering, they said that as soon as one of the pastors who had a lot of influence in their community and the parents and children who go to their school, they saw vaccine enrollment and part of their program go up by 50% in just a couple of days. We have a lot of work to do in building that trust, but making sure you focus on people who are already trusted as leaders and can be your ambassadors is very important. And I do think the Muslim community is a big part of that. Here in Newark, about 20% of people are Muslim, everyone from Shia, Sunni, whole spectrum to nation. And we have all of those constituencies. Most of them are Black Muslims here. And I know that there's been some troubling narratives and disinformation circling communities of faith and our faith for quite some time. And so we do need imams side by side with us, taking the vaccine themselves, hopefully, but very importantly, spreading the message to folks who go to their mosques and are part of their congregations to do so as well.
Dr. Abdelhak, back to you. But before I do that, let me just remind everyone that of the many partners that we've had, and thanks to them, this content's being brought to you by American Muslim health professionals. And please continue to support us. Go to our website, www.amhp.us, to learn more about what we do. We've been working with the National COVID Coalition since its inception in the spring of 2020 and continue to do some of that work to serve along those lines. Dr. Abdelhak, I didn't get a chance to ask you before, how has your faith informed your work with regards to your service? To Dr. Abdelhak.
So I think that, being a Muslim woman has really helped me to have a little bit more compassion and to think outside of the box, because when you believe that there's a higher power, a higher entity that controlling, things that you do and say, then you have to kind of walk in that manner. And so for me, being able to talk about the vaccine and, what it may show, and some people will say, oh, well, I think that this goes against, Islam. I always have to explain to people, if we truly are believers in God and we feel that he controls everything, then what makes us think that he's not the one who assisted mankind to actually produce a vaccine? We often will say, oh, well, this is just something that man created. But you have to, if you truly believe, then you also would believe that sometimes man is given the ability to create something that is very good. And I feel like that just statement or conversation I have with others, they have to really stop and think like, well, maybe that this is something that is being given to us to help decrease deaths and trauma and things like that within our communities. And I definitely rely on my faith for that. I'm very grateful that in my state, one of our local imams, he got the vaccine and he shares his information, and he didn't make it a political thing at all. He just said, this is what's going to protect me so that I can continue to serve our congregation, and definitely encourages others to do that as well. So I was very glad to see that. There's a lot of skepticism, of course, but I think that we have to remember that, we're not in charge, and Allah is in control of all things. And so we have to have that faith as well as we're going forward with this.
And along those lines, tell me more about your work with the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition and the faith-based group that you've been working. How can those groups work more to partner with organizations like the one that Dr. Al-Nahal serves to meet the needs of our communities? And a question to you along those lines, and to you, Dr. Al-Nahal, afterwards. tell us what you're seeing. What are the communities that aren't getting the attention that they need? Are there elderly communities, children with special needs, any particular communities that you're seeing that you say you wish, gosh, we really need to put more efforts, organizations like us as we advocate to state and federal societies? Who are the communities that you're seeing? And again, that partnership question.
Definitely. Well, the Black Muslim COVID Coalition was created because it's not just about race. Even amongst the race, you have so many different groups of people. It could be religious, aspects, essential workers, whether somebody's incarcerated, our mental health status. And so really taking a focus on how COVID-19 impacts us as a whole. And so the organization, I know the first webinar that I actually did for the coalition was medical apartheid, addressing many of the things that we discussed earlier. And how do we not get past these things, but understand these things so that we can then move forward. And so the coalition is really fighting to make sure that others are coming together to work with us, not to just say, oh, well, you guys need food. It's more than that. It's not just having a coat drive or a food drive. It's about actually sitting down and looking at the inequities in our health system and how do we come together and work together to improve these, and looking at all of the different things, not simply just race, because we are very multifaceted people. So we shouldn't just all be lumped into one group, because it's very important. And the immigrant population is huge, especially as Muslims, and we often don't look at their access to care and language barriers and things like that, especially with the rollout of the vaccine. Many people don't speak English. Many people don't have computers or know how to use in our city, they're using like a portal and Sign Up Genius. So how can our masajid come together? Are we calling people? Are we helping to sign people up? Are we hosting our own vaccine drives or getting involved in those manners? And those are things that we want the communities to really look at, especially for Black and brown people.
Outstanding stuff. Dr. Al-Nahal, to you, same question. What can we do to improve those partnerships with faith-based organizations?
Yeah, so Dr. Jahan's comments really resonate with me because, you're seeing examples already of, a singular focus on, let's say, assuming that mass vaccination sites set up in the Bronx or community like Newark does the job, and if you build it, they will come type of mentality when it comes to vaccination. And if you have that narrow view, you'll miss the fact that just because you have a site near someone in proximity, could very well not be enough. And it's also relative because a lot of people don't own their own cars, their own vehicles. Public transportation isn't where it should be in so many parts of the country. And also access to technology to be able to even schedule an appointment for these vaccination centers that only chose to have a digital option for scheduling. All these things are important factors that unfortunately I think were missed in the beginning and we're sort of struggling to catch up with now in some parts of the country. I also want to say that there are some groups that we really need to focus on more generally from a public health perspective that have not had the access that they should, in particular developmentally disabled individuals and people who don't necessarily live in congregate settings to be able to take advantage of some of the pharmaceutical programs the federal government has set up, live at home with caregivers who work every day to take care of their loved ones, who need the vaccine for clinical reasons but haven't been able to get it because there hasn't been an option yet. We have to think about everybody in society, including the most vulnerable, and we have to figure out a solution for that group in particular. But one thing I'll say, and this goes to work with faith-based communities and otherwise, I'll say that in communities of color, what I'm hearing in our sessions is that even for individuals who go through that journey and end up accepting and deciding that the vaccine is right for them, their immediate next question is, okay, Dr. Sharif, you convinced me about this. You convinced me that there's enough will, there's enough funding, there's enough mobilization possible to somehow cure disease in a year. That's a word that's often used that may not be accurate, but the way that it's described in terms of the vaccine. Why aren't you doing this? And why have we seen similar mobilization for public health issues that have been affecting our community for decades? What about advanced stage breast cancer in Black women? What about prostate cancer and colon cancer in Black men? What about chronic disease in Latinx communities and Black communities? that continues to be untreated, and folks have to come to the emergency room because they don't have longitudinal care only when these diseases get really bad and exacerbate. And so those are good questions that unfortunately we don't have good answers to unless we make a promise to these communities to follow on after this public health effort to hopefully get 70-80% of the community vaccinated and get to herd immunity. We need to mobilize and keep that promise to communities of color to finally address their issues, get the funding, get the mobilization, and work with faith-based partners and otherwise to finally get through and offer people the health care that folks in suburban communities have been benefiting from for such a long time. And so that will require everybody, including the Muslim community and beyond, to mobilize and finally execute on.
I just got a note saying that we have over 1,000 viewers, and we're getting a lot of great comments on Facebook and YouTube. Let me just take a quick minute to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to us. Dr. Al-Hall, I want to come back to a remark that you made a few minutes ago. You're partnering with the local school boards and superintendents. And Dr. Abdul-Haq, you are a practicing pediatrician. I imagine you both are getting a ton of questions about returning to school. There's a lot of debate, a lot of controversy on this. A lot of people believe that we need to go back. There's concerns that we don't have the information we need because we don't have good contact tracing in the pediatric community. You mentioned multi-generational families and the potential risk of exposure. There's this question about asymptomatic carriers. Dr. Abdul-Haq, starting with you, what are your thoughts? What are you hearing people say about getting back to school? Are people saying, no, let's wait? Are you seeing, no, we just need to get in there? Are you seeing both?
Definitely, we're seeing both. We're seeing school board meetings that are resulting in knockout dragouts. I mean, literally. So our state, we have several districts that have been in person from the beginning. And then we also have others that have not, and they have taken more precautions. And some of those are larger school districts. We're seeing, mixed pictures. Unfortunately, we still didn't really figure out the best way to open schools. We just kind of opened them. Yes, schools are taking precautions of some spacing out youth in making sure that, everyone's wearing masks, et cetera. But some teachers still have said that they haven't received proper PPE to be in the classroom, which causes a lot of fear and anxiety. And then you also have a lot of the youth who have a lot of anxiety about going back because some of the school districts really aren't spacing out the youth. And in the hallways, they're passing people and they feel like their friends, may not be taking it seriously. And so it's a very difficult situation. And being in a state where I see many children who are in person and I also see children who are virtually, I think that we should step back and really look at the patterns that we see, because a lot of the data comes from overseas and we're looking at other countries who've done it successfully, but we're not implementing the same thing. And I will applaud I believe it was the YMCA network in New York. When the pandemic first hit, they stayed open and they actually utilized like other facilities to make sure that they could spread the youth out. I haven't seen any school districts doing that where, say, the gymnasium becomes a classroom, or maybe you're using a local church or another, space, so where you can actually make sure that youth are spread out and that we're lessening that risk of spreading the virus.
So I'm happy to chime in as well. I completely agree with Dr. Abdul-Haq that, you're starting to see information and well done science that shows that the transmission between children and from children to teachers is relatively low risk in settings where folks have gone back to school. But we have to prepare schools to open. And you've heard President Biden say this, and it's part of his American Rescue Plan, to not have a teacher have reliable access to personal protective equipment, at the very least a mask at all times while he or she is at work, is inexcusable. And the schools don't have that ability to protect their own teachers. They should not be in session. Same thing goes with ventilation. We should be sure as much as possible, reasonably, that the ventilation in indoor schools, especially during the winter, is adequate enough to make sure that the risk from classroom to classroom spread and classroom to hallway spread of aerosolized virus is minimized. These are steps that we've taken in our hospital to make sure that our employees are protected. So no one is going to say that because of the pandemic, our nurses can't go to work or our environmental service workers can't go to work. But you bet that we had to make sure that we had enough personal protective equipment for them to go to work safely, and that we had to make sure that negative pressure rooms were in place and the infrastructure was safe for them to work, to be able to do their essential work. So of course, I do believe that teachers are essential workers, but we have to do our jobs as a society to make sure that they're protected in the process. And I do believe that good action will be taken to protect not only our children who are attending those schools, but again, I think the heroic teachers that are going to have to go in and make sure they learn.
And along those lines, you mentioned a little while ago, your discussions with the Board of Education in your area. Starting with you, Dr. Al-Nahal, and to you, Dr. Abdul-Haq, we use vaccines all the time for people to go back to school. My own children had to take MMR. There's a whole host of them. Truth be told, I don't even remember them, but we've got that little card, and now it's all electronic in the state of Michigan to remind people. Let me be candid and ask Dr. Al-Nahal, do you believe that the vaccine should be mandated to go back to school for kids or for staff for that matter?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to start with that question. I think it's a difficult one. Right now, the vaccines are under emergency use authorization, which means that they're approved under a condition where the full body of evidence that we normally use to fully approve a medication or a vaccine isn't available yet. But because we're in the middle of a public health emergency, the FDA has said the population should get it. So under those circumstances, it will be difficult to mandate the vaccine. But also, and I think more importantly, we should be convincing people through good arguments, through a humble approach to communities, and by spreading the truth as much as possible, that it's actually a good thing for them to be taking this vaccine. You really start to run into problems when you mandate things like vaccines, because all of the conspiracy theories get more fuel, and people feel like their rights are taken away, and in some sense they are. So the right approach is to do the work necessary, which is not easy, to do sessions like this with the Muslim community and beyond, to present the facts and present arguments as much as possible to get people through that journey and make them want to take the vaccine. And frankly, that's when I think you'll be able to get more of the population getting it and allowing us to reach that herd immunity threshold sooner. So for now, mandates really aren't necessarily a good idea, in my view.
I completely agree with you. We can't even get a mask mandate in my state. So you're definitely not going to make that mandatory. Just in terms of the pediatric trials, the Pfizer trial has actually completed in terms of the number of that they wanted. I believe it was 3,000 youth ages 12 to 15 to participate, and they're full, but Moderna still hasn't filled their 12 to 18 group. And the other vaccines have not even started their trials in youth. And so, people keep talking about, oh, it's going to be mandatory. I'm like, we haven't even done the studies yet. Let us do the studies, look at the data, and then see whether this is necessary. And as Dr. Al-Nahal said, it's very important that we build the trust within the community. Because you have to remember that there is still a lot of trauma, behind vaccinations and just things that have occurred within the Black and Brown communities. And so we have to gain that trust back. The medical professionals, we have to strive to regain that trust and have these types of discussions. And as he mentioned, coming with a very humble approach, right? Not the approach of, oh, we know everything because we have X, Y, Z number of degrees, but being humble and meeting people where they are and seeing what their hesitancies are. And you'd be surprised how many people I've done a lot of these talks, and so many people have messaged me and said, I decided to get the vaccine just because of one of these talks. And so it's important that we continue to do those things. And just, so people get an idea, the pediatric population, we have had about 2 million documented cases, but I have so many patients who never get tested. The parents never take them. The parents have had it, but they don't ever get them tested. And we have had about 200 pediatric deaths. So it is important that we, look at this population and learn more. They haven't been hit as hard, but the question is, what is to come? What is the future? Not just physically, but also, the mental ramifications of COVID-19 in these populations.
In our final minutes, I want to switch gears to one thing. Both of you have described to me some of the work that you've been doing and facing. Let me start with you, Dr. Abdelhak. In addition to your pediatric training, you would have advanced training in mental health. AMHP has a program where we provide mental health first aid, and we've had unprecedented requests for this training. What we're seeing is the need for mental health services, not just for our own health professionals, but for families. My own family, I will tell you, has really struggled with mental health disorders. Just a year of isolation has taken its toll. Dr. Abdelhak, what have you seen? Dr. Al-Nahal, what have you seen? And what are your thoughts on the mental health needs that have been really brought out by this pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's definitely difficult to remain in isolation. I know, you all's respective states, it's been a lot bigger, a larger shutdown. Our state is kind of all over, kind of gone rogue. So some people aren't as isolated, but the anxiety that we are seeing from youth is crazy. Depression. I'm seeing these children on a regular basis. I've had to admit so many to the hospital, for psychiatric hospitals for treatment, so many suicide attempts, and unfortunately some have been successful as well. So it's very important that we look at the mental health aspects with our youth, and also for parents to take it seriously. If your child is at home, they're staying in their room, and you're like, oh, well, they're fine, they're just quiet and staying in their room, they may not be okay. I feel like everyone right now needs a counselor or a therapist, right? It's just so difficult to deal with this, but also seeking out, especially those of us who are Muslim, prayer or other faith-based groups. Prayer definitely can help, but also reminding yourselves for meditation or mindfulness exercises that you can do, and going outside. I can't stress how important it is to go outside and get some vitamin D. And I have children who are afraid to go outside, and I'm like, you're not going to catch COVID on your front porch or your backyard. Like, it's important that we really, really push that, because we're staying indoors and we're just really suffering mentally, because we're not meant to hibernate like bears.
ITV, Call of Peace, Save Humanity.